Welcome back everyone to Criminal Law. In this lesson we're going to talk about the elements of a crime, and this is essentially outlining the next of our major topics for criminal law, which are essentially the elements for a crime, the different component parts that are required to show criminal liability. Now this isn't just the two main component parts, the sort of equation for criminal liability, which for those who don't already know, we're talking about the actus reus of an offence and then the mens rea of an offence, but also all of the more subsidiary details that exist in this particular vein as well. So this involves also talking about causation. This involves talking about omissions as a way of giving rise to criminal liability. It is also a way of talking about things relating to strict liability offences where mens rea is not necessarily a required component feature. So that's what we're going to cover when we talk about this whole general topic on the components of criminal liability. We will explain the process by which an individual is found guilty or not guilty of a particular of an offence as well during this process, and essentially just talk about how we find criminal liability. Now we're going to do so with reference to a variety of different crimes. So for example, in showing omissions or showing strict liability or mens rea or actus reus, there are various different crimes that we can examine, but we're going to try and limit our understanding of the specifics of those crimes to when we actually get on to looking at them in the future. So if, for example, we cover a case in this series on murder or sexual offences, we're going to try and look at the component elements of that case, which exemplifies, for example, the mens rea, or exemplifies the idea of an omission or causation, rather than the specific offence itself, which of course we will get to when we look at those offences in more detail as we go on through this series. When we find criminal liability, we find it through the circumstances when the prosecution, often done under the auspices of the Crown Prosecution Service, can show that that the defendant satisfies the elements of criminal liability, and that in addition to this, there are no valid defences to the conduct which was committed. So one of the things that people fail to recognise in some regard is that when we find criminal liability, we also have to take into account any kind of valid defence. So that has to also be shown as well. And so it means that there has to be the presence of the various elements of criminal liability, for the most part. We will get to strict liability in the future, and that the absence of a valid defence is also present. There is also no valid defence, whether this is a defence which is full or whether this is a defence which is partial. So some partial offences may not necessarily absolve criminal liability in its entirety, but may reduce criminal liability from, say, murder to manslaughter, for example. So we can divide criminal liability into its component elements, and then we can minus the valid defence. We will get to defences after we have covered the offences at the end of this series of lessons. So the question is, what are the elements of criminal liability? Well, this is a question that really depends on the particular crime that we're talking about. So when we go on to explore the nature of various offences and various crimes, we'll be able to divide them into their constituent parts and really find where criminal liability arises. This is really easy for, say, statutory offences. So when we look at, for example, sections 1 of the Sexual Offences Act, we can clearly just read it down and we can just highlight what are the different individual component parts of criminal liability for section 1 of the Sexual Offences Act. It's a little bit more difficult when we are talking about common law offences, because of course this is deriving out of the various principles of judge-made law, but it's not impossible, and it's not too much. It's not that difficult to establish. So when we look at criminal liability, the elements of criminal liability to the specific crimes will often fall into one of two main categories. They'll be defined by either the actus reus of an offence or the mens rea of an offence. Now, these are arguably the two most important principles that you should really understand before even examining any other element of criminal law. So that's why we're spending so much time examining them in this series. Beginning first then, the actus reus, the phrase itself, if we were to just translate it, simply means guilty act. And so while this is true for the most part, it doesn't mean necessarily that an act is required to fulfill an actus reus for an offence. We will get to omissions in the future. But for now, the idea of an actus reus is the guilty act, essentially doing the thing that leads to criminal liability. So if it is murder, then it is doing the murdering, doing the actual physical act itself that is the guilty act. Again, when we say guilty act, that infers or implies that may have to be a positive act, a thing that you have to do. But criminal liability can also arise in certain circumstances out of an omission, i.e. failing to do a particular thing as well. So we'll get to that in the future. But fundamentally, the actus reus of a crime generally refers to the thing that is done where criminal liability is incurred. So if we are talking about theft, it is the appropriation, the appropriation of a particular piece of property. If it is, like I've said, murder, it is the sort of homicide element, the killing of an individual, ending a person's life. In conjunction with the actus reus, we also have to think about the idea of mens rea. Mens rea refers to the idea of a guilty mind, and it comes out of the Latin maxim of actus non facit reum nisi mensit rea, which essentially tells us that it means that essentially the fact is not guilty unless the mind is guilty. So there has to be a correspondence of actus reus and mens rea for a particular offence to give rise to criminal liability, for example. So it's not just enough necessarily in some circumstances to just have done a guilty act. One has to also do so with a guilty mind. It is also never enough to just have a guilty mind. You cannot be convicted of an offence because you had a guilty mind and you didn't actually perform the offence. The performance of the offence in conjunction with the mens rea is where criminal liability arises, in the majority of circumstances. Like I said, I'm going to put a little asterisk there because, of course, you also have strict liability offences as well, which take mens rea very little in. They're generally not that bothered about the mens rea in strict liability offences, and we'll get to that in the future. So, like I said, we'll get to this because there is not necessarily the requirement of a prerequisite mens rea in every single case. But generally speaking, if we were to then construct criminal liability, we can take all of these factors into account and we can construct criminal liability as the actus reus plus this idea of the mens rea, the guilty act plus the guilty mind, minus a valid defence, okay? So we're taking away any idea of a valid defence. There is no valid, because if there was a valid defence and that defence was full, then the individual would be found not guilty and there wouldn't be criminal liability. So it is the guilty act plus the guilty mind minus the valid defence, all of which gives rise to criminal liability. And this is the general structure in which we're going to look at the construction of the various crimes that we are going to examine. So when we look at murder, for example, we're going to do so by looking first at the actus reus, what are the requirements there, and then the mens rea, the correspondence of the two. There are some cases that are quite interesting in that regard. And then we'll talk about valid defences, and then also think about how that gives rise to criminal liability. The same with theft, the same with sexual offences, the same with dishonesty offences as well, and non-fatal offences, all of which are going to be constructed on the basis of this actus reus plus this mens rea, this guilty act plus the guilty mind. But for now and for the next lesson, we're going to begin by talking about actus reus in its general form, in its generality, by talking about what it actually means to have a guilty act, talk about the distinction between an act and an omission, talk about the idea of criminal conduct, talk about the causation of the conduct with reference to the liability that arises, before we then move on to talking about mens rea and strict liability, etc., etc.